Let's start with prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let's pray. Hear our prayers, Holy God. Breathe your spirit over us and all the earth, that barriers would crumble and divisions cease. Make us more fully your co-healers of this broken world. Unite us with all people in bonds of love, that the whole earth and all its peoples may be at peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Sandra, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joshua. That was a great prayer also to get us started. So welcome to everyone who's watching on Zoom and eventually in the nave at St. Columba's to our presentation, Honoring Their Roots, One African-American Family's Struggle Between Freedom and Equality in Northwest Washington. This presentation is sponsored by Stirring the Waters, St. Columba's Ministry for Racial Justice. To accommodate our speaker schedules, this forum has been pre-recorded before a small audience who will be able to pose some questions following the presentation using the chat function. The forum will then be shown on January 16th, both on St. Columba's YouTube site and in the nave. And so we are absolutely delighted to present our speakers, Clara Green and Barbara Torrey, to tell us about their recently published book, Between Freedom and Equality, The History of an African-American Family in Washington, D.C. Clara Green, known by her friends as Tiggy, is a longtime parishioner at St. Columba's. Tiggy and her neighbor and colleague, Barbara Torrey, have spent now nearly 15 years, initially exploring the history of their neighborhood near the C&O Canal in Maryland. This project then led them to unearthing and documenting the remarkable story of a formerly enslaved man named George Pointer and his descendants. To orient you just a bit before we get into their presentation, at St. Columba's, we've been considering the history of our own parish and its relationship with the community formerly known as Reno City. Those of you who watched our earlier presentation in October may recall this map of St. Albans Parish in 1911, and it shows toward the middle, maybe a little higher up in the map, St. Columba's off there a bit to the left, and then up a little north and to the right is St. George's, which was St. Columba's former mission church in the Reno City community. What Barbara and Tiggy have done is remarkable. It expands both the geographic reach of our story as well as the timeline by tracing the Pointer descendants throughout much of Northwest Washington over a period of 150 years, going back to the time of George Washington. The family lived and thrived in the areas along the Potomac and the C&O Canal, which we can see sort of on the left side of the map, in Georgetown, which is at the very southern end of this map. That included in Georgetown time working at St. John's Episcopal Parish. It also includes their time in what is today Chevy Chase, DC, as well as in the former Reno City community. While racist policies forced them from their homes in each of these areas, their story is nevertheless one of endurance and of their many achievements and contributions to Washington, D.C. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Barbara and Tiggy.
Thank you very much, Sandra. We are very impressed with what you all are doing, and we hope that our research will be able to be useful to you. Our story started with a letter written by a former slave in the 18th century. And he was, we read about it in when we were doing a local history. This is a copy of the letter. You can see that the handwriting is better than either one of our handwriting on this. It was 11 pages. We knew it was in the National Archives, and the next time we went to the archives, we put this on our list to try to find it. And it's sitting there. It's been there for almost 200 years. And it is an extraordinary document that was so compelling that Tiggy and I started trying to figure out who was this man and why didn't we know about him. His letter describes his owner renting him to the Potomac Canal Company, and that the canal company actually gave him a small cottage to live in, which is today just north of Lock 6 of the C&O Canal. And if this was the canal, the Potomac Canal Company was in fact a dream of George Washington's. He felt that they needed, this was right after the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, that they needed to open up trade with the frontier. But the Potomac River, unfortunately, has a lot of falls in it. And he got in 1785, when he was after the Revolutionary War and before the Constitution, he was got together Maryland and Virginia to talk about doing a joint project of improving the navigation of the Potomac, and it became the first inter commerce treaty in the United States, happening before the Constitution, actually. If you show the map, the next slide. He was born in what is the first arrow at the top. It was a tobacco plantation at the time. And he was then rented, his owner rented him to the Potomac Canal Company, where when he was about 14 years old, and that's the second arrow there, where his little house was next to Lock 6 on the C&O Canal. He was able to buy his freedom at about age 19, but he continued working for the canal company for the rest of his life. In fact, he was one of the first, this is the picture that shows both that George Washington, who was the head of the board and the president of the board, would go out and inspect this. This is, in fact, if you look over on the right hand behind George Washington's person there, if you look behind, that's Great Falls. So this is what it looked like to actually be digging this canal around both Great Falls and Little Falls itself. When they improved this, the navigation on this, Pointer continued working for them and became, in fact, over time, a supervisory engineer. after he was free, and he signed his letter Captain George Pointer, so that he was actually a well-known person on the canal itself. When he bought his freedom at age 19, he married Elizabeth Townsend, and then he had the first of their 3 children. He continued working for them with increasing responsibilities. The interesting thing for us was that we didn't know where this story was going. We were just interested in George Pointer. We then did as much research we could on him. And then one at a time, we began learning about his family members and then his descendants. It meant that because we didn't know where the story was going, we didn't have a hypothesis or theories about what was happening. And it was only when we looked backwards over the 6 generations that we found that we saw several themes emerge across these different generations. One theme, which was quite clear in the 18th and 19th century, is how fragile the freedom was for the few African Americans who actually were free. They, in fact, had a number of prohibitions. They were not able to own guns or dogs without permission. They had to carry with them certificates of freedom. Otherwise, if they didn't have a certificate of freedom, they were, in fact, could be sold back into slavery. They had, one of the problems, of course, is the certificate of freedom. All legal documents had to be signed by white people and as a witness. And this was itself revealing, because we could see, we were surprised at the witness of in 2 different instances of in this story, and it showed us something much more interesting than we had realized about the friendships across the different races. Our second theme was the shifting nature of racism in the 19th and 20th century. Racism was endemic, but it was not static. And one very good example was Nat Turner's. After Nat Turner's attack in 1831, white people, especially in Maryland and the district, were horrified by this. The Maryland legislature immediately funded the Maryland Colonization Society and made a census of all the free African Americans that they were going to send to Liberia. This, in fact, one of George Pointer's daughters was on that list, although we never found her name on any of the manifests. In the 1830s, in DC, there were race riots with horrific stories of what happened in the race riots themselves. And of course, during the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War and then Reconstruction, the nature of racism continued to change. A third theme that we found was that despite how fragile the freedom was and how endemic the racism was, the Pointer families lived in remarkably stable communities of both Black and white neighbors. It doesn't mean that that there wasn't racism in these neighborhoods, but it did mean that their children were playing each other. One of the ways you can tell this is if you go back and use the original census pages, read the pages that written in the enumerator's handwriting, because it shows you who the neighbors were and the characteristic of the neighbors. And George Pointer and his son's family lived in what he calls his cottage for almost 60 years. And there were both black and white neighbors, often for decades, living nearby. Pointer's granddaughter, in fact, moved after the Nat Turner rebellion, moved out into this rural area that you see on this map called Washington County. It was about 3 times larger than the DC, Georgetown urban areas, but it had 7% of the population. So it was completely farmland. And she and her husband moved out and eventually bought a 2-acre farm where approximately where that arrow is. Their neighbors in that area were both black and white and immigrants and long-term plantation owners. It was a complete mix of people there. It turned out that the property where their farm was eventually became Lafayette Elementary School. And that is the story that we'll tell at the end of how that came to be. If you go to the next slide, that's it. This is our, we don't have this 6th generation, fell off the bottom of that, but there's a 6th generation there. And you can see all of the people we found one at a time. The problem with these family trees is they look very linear, but the fact is putting them together is very messy, certainly nonlinear, and there were lots of unexpected surprises as we put this together. When we were doing this, we were using the censuses as the scaffolding to build the family line. But the censuses are not good enough to tell a multi-generational story. So that's when we had to go to lots of other documents. The keystone person in this is in the 3rd generation, Mary Ann. She was the granddaughter who was raised by George and Elizabeth Pointer. And she was the one who we found both her certificate of freedom and also then in 1928, the Washington Post article that actually featured her and one of her daughters. The interesting thing about the Washington Post article is that it did not mention the fact that the farm had been actually invaded by the Confederate cavalry in 1864 in the middle of the Civil War. But Tiggy will pick that story up.
Okay, maybe the next slide. We'll see a photo of Union troops on Mason's Island. Once the war was declared, there were Union troops all over the district, and including in Georgetown. And that's where the Pointers' granddaughter's 2 eldest sons had gone to find work in about 61, 62. And here we see Union soldiers checking IDs on what is now called Roosevelt Island at the ferry landing. And across the river, you can see Georgetown. And this island where these people are standing became important in 1863 because it was made the site of the training of the very first regiment of Black troops that were under federal control. Black men had been anxious to fight for the Union, but there was substantial prejudice against doing so. And finally, in May of 1863, the federal government created what was called the U.S. Colored Troops, or USCT. And the very first regiment of the USCT was in the district. And there were 10 companies of 100 men each that were trained on this island here. It was a bit isolated and away from the eyes of the public and possible abuse by locals. The men could be safely trained. The next photo will show the first regiment of the USCT, and this is a Matthew Brady photo. In July of 1863, the two eldest sons of Pointer's granddaughter joined this regiment. And it was a brave decision for Black men to enlist in the Union Army, because any captured Black soldier was at great risk of being killed or sold into slavery by the rebel army. Although the USCT regiments were part of the Union Army, they were not treated equally. The men were paid less than soldiers in white regiments, and they could not hold a rank above sergeant. So their officers were white, and in the middle of this picture, closest to the screen, you'll see there are some white men, and that would have been their officers. And the men saw fierce fighting in Petersburg and elsewhere, and they always proved their excellence in every battle. This map from 1864, when the two brothers were fighting in Petersburg, the parents and siblings on the farm, known as Dry Meadows Farm, that's what they called the farm, were endangered when Confederate troops invaded the district, and they came from the north. And this map shows skirmish lines that took place right around their property. The arrow points to about where their property was. The rebels were trying to attack Fort Stevens, which was 2 miles away. The residents thus were forced to flee their homes because the rebels were burning houses and crops, and they had to flee toward the city. It's not known what damage was done to the granddaughters' Dry Meadows farm, but all the residents were able to return after several days, 2 or 3 days. The next photo, this is after the war in 1868, and it shows a view of the port of Georgetown. And the photo again is taken from Roosevelt Island. And we can see Georgetown University's buildings a bit to the left, I think, there in the background. After the war, 3 of Pointer's great-grandsons who'd grown up on the Dry Meadows farm eventually settled in Georgetown. It was a flourishing port and a good place where Black men could find work opportunities. This map of Georgetown dates to 1874, and it shows the old street names before they, 20 years later, they were changed to coincide with the street names in the city. And there was a 15-year period that the 3 Pointer great-grandsons would live near. There were 4 of them total, and 3 of them came to Georgetown to live near one another. And they all found stability that they had known growing up on the farm, the Dry Meadows farm. The eldest of the 3 settled in an area called Herring Hill, which would be the northeast quadrant of this map, located east of 29th Street. It was a thriving area. If you can see the Rock Creek along the edge of the map, and its location was close to Rock Creek, and that was a great advantage for people for fishing and things. And that family always lived there, same address, and his work, the son's work as a laborer, supported a stable home life. His younger brother eventually arrived in Georgetown seeking work as well, and he too established his family there, but he settled on the western top corner there of the map near the Georgetown University. And that, let me see, that settlement was called Bryantown, and it was primarily Black. And he supported his family as a driver in the port. They were not far from what is now Georgetown University. And after 10 years, they lived there in the same address. They were forced to move because the government the DC government chose their Bryantown neighborhood to build a new high school for white children, which would become Western High School. And the government used eminent domain to buy the property, forcing people out of their homes, Black people out of their homes in the Bryantown neighborhood. And this was the first example that we found of Pointer descendants being affected by the government's use of eminent domain to construct schools. The third son to go to Georgetown was the youngest, who arrived several years after his brothers. He had remained with the family during the war. And then after the war, when construction brought schooling to the area, for the Black children who were able to get an education for the first time. And in 1866, a one-room school building was built not far from their Dry Meadows farm. And this son, as well as his younger sister, the two of them became literate. So when he went to Georgetown, his education made a difference in his employment opportunity. And the next photo will show you the school. This is not the school that he attended, which was a one room school, but this was the school that for Black children called the Grant Road School, which replaced that little one room school. In the 1880s, the Black children of Tenleytown area were moved into this building, a 2-room structure. It had once served the white children, who then went on to a new, bigger building. This building was vastly inadequate for the number of Black children in the area, but nevertheless, 2 generations of Pointer descendants got their educations there. There would not be a new school for the growing number of Black families until 1903, when the Jesse Reno School was built. Lorenzo, the youngest brother, who went to Georgetown, found work as a sexton at St. John's Episcopal Church there. And it was an unusual opportunity because at that time, there were very few Black men that held the job of sexton, and his literacy probably made a difference in his obtaining the job. It's worth noting here that the Reverend Dowse of St. George's Mission Church in Tenley became vicar of St. John's. That was years later, and by then, Lorenzo, the young son, was no longer at St. John's. His work had led to a promotion and a new job as sexton at St. Paul's Episcopal Cathedral in Buffalo, New York. And he never returned to live in Washington. He spent his life at that job, and but he remained a trustee for the Moses Society in Tenleytown. And that, of course, was a Black benevolent society. It had a hall connected to the Rock Creek Baptist Church, and in a minute we'll see a map of that, where those places are. So literacy generally transformed the lives of the men, but it did not do that for the women in the Pointer family. And they continued, as many of the women of that time, working as maids and as laundresses. This was true for the youngest Pointer, who grew up on the farm, the only surviving daughter of the family, and she always remained at Dry Meadows. She brought up her own family there, and her 4 children attended the little Grant Road School that we saw. It's here. Here we have a photo of an electric streetcar, and it shows the streetcar that ran along Wisconsin Avenue up to the border between the district and Maryland, and it's a good symbol of the change in development that came to the district. And with the improvement of transportation with these streetcars at the end of the 19th century, they brought city dwellers out to the rural areas of Washington County, and developers soon followed. Real estate barons of the Gilded Age, such as Francis Newlands, bought off large tracts of farmland, and they wanted to build modern suburbs for the affluent white residents, white people. And Newlands called his development, as we know, Chevy Chase. And once plots of land began to be built, the newly arrived white families needed schools. And so in the new Chevy Chase suburb and elsewhere, the DC government began using eminent domain to force families who were living in primarily Black neighborhoods to sell their land so that to build schools for white children. Homes in the new developments, the new suburbs, contained restrictive racial covenants, so that established segregation for good. In 1903, in the turn of the century, just after the turn of the century, you still see large farm properties, as you can see, and then there's this pink triangle, which is where the granddaughters farm. That's their property in 1903. But this 2-acre farm, as large as it was, wasn't large enough for all the extended family members with their children to live. So in 1917, 2 of George Pointer's great-grandchildren, William Moten and his sister Rosetta Moten, who married a man named Harris, moved with their spouses and their children to Reno. And this was a thriving African-American community, as you know, and their children were able to attend the Jesse Reno School. And William Moten became a funeral director, and he prospered and bought a house on Denison Street in Reno. In this map, we see the location of the Jesse Reno School, surrounded in red. You see the Rock Creek Baptist Church and the Moses Hall connected to it in blue. And the cemetery is outlined in yellow, and that cemetery was connected to the Moses Society. But DC and real estate developers eventually forced William and Rosetta and other people living in the area in order to build a school, the Alice Deal Middle School, and the park. This map of 1925 of Chevy Chase shows that little by little the farm properties had been bought up, and the Black settlement along Broad Branch Road, where the Dry Meadows farm was situated, was soon threatened. And this blue arrow points to that, again, the pink triangle, which is located right where Patterson Street meets Broad Branch. And it's interesting to see that all these little individual lots are smaller than the Pointer's granddaughter's 2-acre property. The next slide shows a photo of, this photo appeared in the Washington Post in 1928, and it shows the frame farmhouse on the Dry Meadows property on Broad Branch Road. It's a rather extraordinary find. And seated in the front at the door is the Pointer's great-granddaughter, Mary Moten, and the last descendant to live there before she was forced to sell the property that same year in 1928. We believe that inset photo of the woman, an older woman smoking a pipe, is a picture of her mother, which would have been the Pointer's granddaughter, who with her husband bought the 2-acre property. Dry Meadows Farm had been owned for some 80 years. It had been home to 3 generations of the family, but it was lost in the forced sale to the government in 1928 so that Lafayette Elementary School could be built. Between 1885 and 1928, the use of eminent domain affected 4 Pointer descendants in 3 different generations. Today, Duke Ellington School for the Arts in Georgetown, Lafayette Elementary School in Chevy Chase, Alice Deal Middle School, and Wilson High School in Tenleytown are all on land where the Pointer descendants used to live. And the displacement of the families made the neighborhoods more segregated than they had been in the 18th and 19th centuries. This photo is of the Pointer descendants reunion. The story we've been able to tell of George Pointer and his descendants was revealed to us little by little, and we didn't find his present day descendant, James Fisher, right away. James Fisher was the 5th great grandson of George Pointer, and his partner is a genealogist, Tanya Hardy, and meeting them was a fantastic surprise, and it came through Ancestry. Our connection came through Ancestry.com. They were starting their research of the family history in the 20th century. We were in the 18th century going toward the present, and we were as shocked to find them and they were shocked to find us. We met with them along the Potomac River where George Pointer had once lived. And then they arranged the first reunion of the Pointer descendants, and they held it at Lafayette School Park where their ancestors had once lived. And it's now known as Lafayette Pointer Park. And that is due to their efforts along with some local residents. James and Tanya have worked hard to link the current Pointer descendants to their past, and they continue to work to promote the family history in the Washington, D.C. area. And this story owes a lot to them. Thank you.
Okay. Well, so this is what happens when St. Columbans and their neighbors start researching their own neighborhoods. It's just such a remarkable story. And to have it brought up to the present is also just, I'm just speechless by it. So thank you for your detailed presentation and for your contribution to our understanding of our collective history. It helps to get past this amnesia, I guess, that we have all been afflicted with for, well, over 100 years now. I'm hoping that we'll have a few questions in the chat, but let me just kick off a bit with a few of my own. I read the introduction that James Fisher prepared along with Tanya to your book. And I highly recommend anyone to read that. Well, what I'm wondering is whether James and Tanya have ever actually been interviewed, and if there's a way that we can see them speaking about how the discovery of their own family history has affected them.
You know, we've appeared with them several places. One was in Politics and Prose last spring, and another one was the DC History Center interview. And they were in that too. And I think there have been several others. So you should be able to access both of those
On YouTube.
On YouTube, yeah.
You could search using the title of the book on YouTube and you'll find that.
Great, thank you for that. Also, I'm wondering if you've made any special arrangements for, you know, the use of any proceeds from the sale of your book. Is there some special provision that you've made?
All proceeds, all royalties will go to Chevy Chase, historic Chevy Chase, DC, and James Fisher and Tanya Hardy are on the board, and they will see how they will spend the proceeds to develop this kind of history and this history of George Pointer in DC and the family.
That's terrific, and thank you for making that possible. So we're trying to see whether there are some other questions in the chat. I know there was one question from Elizabeth Vaden. She wanted to know, where can you get the book? Where can we get this book? I think I got mine on Amazon.
It's on Amazon. It's also on Politics and Prose. There also turns out that there's an audio book of it. I think you can get on Amazon. We wanted them to get Denzel Washington to do the reading, but they said he was too expensive.
So there's another question here. Blaine Hurd would like to know how George Pointer acquired the title captain. Do you know?
No, you know, it's really interesting. It's the only time that we've seen him referenced that way, but he was such a modest person. When you read his letter, you'll realize he's not giving that name to himself. Somebody has given him that name, and so we don't know the origins
Of Captain.
of Captain.
Yeah, he had his own boat. He was always on the Potomac River in his boat, working for the company.
And what was the origin of the Pointer name? Do you know? Was that the name of his former owner?
No, it's not. And in fact, it turns out that the vast majority of free African Americans never took the name of their owner, as you can understand. We don't know where it came from. We have a section in the book about what Pointer has meant at different times, what the word has meant as an English name, pointing to the North Star, several other things, but we have no idea where it came from. But his owner was Wallace, so we know that it was.
Someone else has said that they were curious about the reference to the benevolent society the Pointer family members were part of. Did societies like that play a big role in Black society in Fort Reno at the time? Do you know?
Well, I think it did, in terms of it helped pay for burials. It helped families that were in need. So it was a very local organization. I think they had a Moses Society variety of branches in different places, even into Maryland. But this particular one would have helped local people. The idea in the beginning, there was a religious element to it, but in the beginning, it would have helped the local people pay for funerals, that sort of thing, and just anyone in need.
Here's another question. Did the use of eminent domain to create Wilson, Murch, Hearst, and Eaton schools displace Black communities? Do you know that?
We don't know that. And one of the really important research projects that we would love somebody to do is to look at the schools that were built in the 1920s and 1930s in DC for white students, and go back to the property records and find out who was living there before. We have we were able to document 4 times when that happened. I would be very interested to see how systematic it was in other parts of the district. But that's a really good question, and we need to find the answer to that.
And we'll here's one more question. I think you have information about this, probably from James Fisher. Do we know where the Pointer family members who were displaced by eminent domain actually went?
Yes, the Motons ended up, the daughter ended up, Rosetta, her name was, ended up in Northeast, and other family members joined her there. Her brother, Will, who had been quite a successful funeral director, ended up downtown in a nice building, property that he owned. So generally, and of course now, the family dispersed. James talks about that in whenever he's interviewed. So his family was not close. He lives out in Maryland, in Hyattsville.
So the family was then affected essentially by being scattered around as a result of this displacement then.
And we also ran out of censuses. The census is not published until 70 years later. So we could only go as far as 1940. Next year, I think, we will get the 1950 and be able to see a little bit better where people went.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this incredible presentation. I think that Bill Jensen is going to sign us out here. I'm going to move over so you can see Bill.
Quite all right, Sandra. Tiggy and Barbara, we can't thank you enough on behalf of Stirring the Waters and St. Columba's. This has just been a terrific presentation, so informative. At St. Columba's, we look forward to continuing this exploration this spring, and just look for further announcements in terms of our learning about our neighborhood and our role in Northwest DC. I'd like to pray us out now. Lord Jesus Christ, who reached across the ethnic boundaries between Samaritan, Roman, and Jew, who offered fresh sight to the blind and freedom to captives, help us break down the barriers in our community. Enable us to see the reality of racism and bigotry, and free us to challenge and uproot it from ourselves, our society, and our world. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks. This was wonderful. Just beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Where can I enter?
Thank you.
Up top right there.